April 11, 1945. 14 miles north of Okinawa, Lieutenant Commander Wilbur G. Jones gripped the railing of the destroyer USS Hadley as radar operators below decks tracked what appeared to be impossible numbers. 156 inbound contacts, all bearing directly toward the American picket line. Jones had commanded anti-aircraft batteries through 2 years of Pacific combat. He understood the mathematics of aerial defense. His ship carried 12 5-inch guns, 4 twin 40mm mounts, and 11 20mm positions. Against conventional attacks, this firepower provided adequate defense. Against what was approaching, it seemed woefully insufficient. The Japanese aircraft were not coming to drop bombs and escape. They were coming to die. Each plane carried a pilot who had already written farewell letters, distributed personal belongings, and drunk ceremonial sake. The special attack units, the Kamikaze, represented Japan's final tactical evolution, born from desperation and the recognition that conventional attacks had become suicidal without achieving suicide's purpose. What these kamikaze pilots did not know, what Japanese Naval Command had failed to comprehend through nearly 18 months of operations, was that American ships were firing shells that hunted aircraft, not shells aimed at where planes would be, but shells that sensed proximity and detonated themselves at optimal distance. Technology that military theorists worldwide had declared impossible was destroying Japanese aircraft at rates that defied every pre-war calculation. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapon that was about to save Hadley and dozens of ships like her began not as a response to kamikaze attacks, which wouldn't emerge until late 1944, but as a solution to a problem that had plagued anti-aircraft gunners since aircraft first became weapons of war. The fundamental challenge was brutally simple. Aircraft moved at 300 to 400 miles per hour. Anti-aircraft shells required 15 to 30 seconds to reach altitude. Hitting a maneuvering target required predicting its exact position at the moment of shell arrival. In 1941, before American entry into the war, it required approximately 2,500 shells to destroy a single enemy aircraft under ideal conditions. In combat, with multiple targets executing evasive maneuvers through clouds and smoke, the odds dropped catastrophically. Some estimates ranged as high as 100,000 rounds per kill. The morning of December 7, 1941 demonstrated this inadequacy with tragic clarity. As Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, American gun crews fought back with every available weapon. 5-inch naval guns thundered from damaged battleships and cruisers, hurling 55-pound shells at dive bombers and torpedo planes screaming through tropical skies. Each shell required manual fuse setting, a sailor turning a wrench against a clockwork mechanism while enemy aircraft dove through defensive fire. Most shells exploded harmlessly in empty sky, their preset timers detonating them seconds too early or too late. Others fell back to earth, their contact fuses still armed. In Honolulu, 9 miles from the harbor, these shells crashed through roofs, detonated in streets, and tore through buildings. The Hayasaki family died when a 5-inch shell flew through their restaurant window during breakfast service. Father Jitsuo, sons Jackie and Robert, daughter Shirley, and nephew George perished instantly, along with 7 young men eating at the Cherry Blossom restaurant. By the time smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, 68 civilians lay dead. 32 of them had been killed not by Japanese bombs, but by improperly fused American anti-aircraft shells landing in Honolulu. The tragedy illustrated with brutal clarity what naval commanders already knew. Existing anti-aircraft technology was inadequate against modern aerial warfare. The concept of a proximity fuse had existed in theory for decades. Make a fuse that could detect when it approached a target and detonate automatically. Simple in concept, impossible in practice given the technology of the 1930s. Germany had explored proximity fuses as early as 1930, developing over 30 different designs: acoustic sensors that would trigger on engine noise, electrostatic detectors that would respond to charged aircraft surfaces, photoelectric cells that would respond to light reflected from targets, By 1939, after investing millions of Reichsmarks and thousands of engineering hours, German researchers concluded the technical challenges were insurmountable. The components were too large, too fragile, or insufficiently reliable. Hitler's leadership issued directives in 1940, prioritizing only projects that could reach production within 6 months to support the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. Germany's proximity fuse programs were among the casualties, though limited work would resume in 1944, far too late to affect the war's outcome. By 1939, researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had conceived of using miniature Doppler radar. They tested prototypes on rockets, which faced far less severe acceleration than gun-fired shells. But Britain's program was stymied by 2 critical obstacles. The cost was astronomical, and Britain's industrial capacity was already stretched beyond breaking. More fundamentally, they could not solve the miniaturization problem. The smallest vacuum tubes available, those used in hearing aids, were still far too delicate to survive the violent acceleration of being fired from a gun. When a 5-inch shell is fired, it accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in roughly 20 feet of gun barrel. This creates an acceleration force of 20,000 times the force of Earth's gravity. Every component experiences crushing force equivalent to being hit by a sledgehammer. The shell then spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it passes through the rifled barrel. By 1941, British scientists had working prototypes that functioned perhaps 50% of the time under ideal conditions. For military use, this was inadequate. The British shared their research through the TISAD mission when America entered the war. But it would be American scientists and American industry that transformed theoretical possibility into mass-produced reality. The National Defense Research Committee, formed on June 27, 1940, brought together leading American physicists and engineers under the direction of Vannevar Bush. Among them was Merle Tuve, a physicist at the Carnegie Institution, whose brilliant but volatile temperament would drive a team that eventually numbered over 1,000 scientists and engineers. The problem they faced was straightforward to state, but seemingly impossible to solve. Tuve's Section T, established at what became the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University on March 10, 1942, in a rented Chevrolet garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, settled on a radio-based proximity fuse using Doppler radar principles. A miniature transmitter in the nose of the shell would emit radio waves at approximately 180 to 220 MHz. When these waves struck a target and reflected back, the frequency would shift due to the Doppler effect. When the reflected signal reached a predetermined frequency, indicating the target was within lethal range, an electrical circuit would close and detonate the shell. The theory was elegant. Making it work was another matter entirely. Consider the engineering challenges. The fuse had to fit into the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell, leaving room for 7 pounds of high explosive. Inside this space, perhaps 8 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, engineers had to fit a complete radio transmitter and receiver, a power source, safety mechanisms, and a detonator. All of this had to function in temperature extremes from Arctic cold to tropical heat and survive storage for months. Most daunting of all, it had to withstand the shock of being fired from a gun at 20,000 times the force of gravity, then function perfectly during the few seconds of flight time before reaching the target. James Van Allen, a young physicist who joined the Applied Physics Laboratory in April 1942 as a founding member, faced the task of developing what the team called rugged vacuum tubes. He started with miniature tubes that Raytheon and Sylvania had developed for hearing aids. These were designed for the gentle environment of sitting in someone's pocket, not the violence of artillery fire. Working with Sylvania Company engineers, Van Allen redesigned the tubes from first principles. The glass envelopes were thickened and carefully annealed to distribute stress. The internal filaments and grids were redesigned with shorter spans and heavier cross-sections to resist distortion. The tubes were potted in wax inside the fuse body, which cushioned them against shock while allowing heat dissipation. Every aspect was tested by firing complete fuses from a vertical gun into the ground at the Naval Proving Grounds in Dahlgren, Virginia. The soft earth caught the shells gently enough that researchers could recover the fuses and examine the tubes under microscopes to see what had broken. Through hundreds of test firings and thousands of design iterations, the team gradually developed tubes that could survive. By September 1941, they were achieving success rates above 50%. The Navy, desperate for any improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness, accepted this failure rate and authorized mass production tooling. The engineers were confident they could improve reliability during the production ramp-up. They were right. By early 1943, reliability had climbed above 90%, but vacuum tubes were only one challenge among many. The fuse needed a power source. Conventional batteries were too large and had limited shelf life, particularly in tropical heat. Engineers developed a reserve battery that used liquid electrolyte kept separate from the battery plates until activation. When the shell was fired, centrifugal force spun the electrolyte into contact with the plates, generating electricity. This gave the batteries indefinite storage life, while providing a built-in safety mechanism. The fuse needed multiple additional safety mechanisms. It could not arm until well clear of the gun to prevent detonation if a round misfired. It required protection against accidental detonation from radio interference or the ship's own radar. It needed wave suppression circuitry to prevent premature detonation when fired at low angles over water, where radio waves would reflect from the ocean surface. Each safety feature added complexity. By the time development was complete, each proximity fuse contained approximately 100 to 30 miniaturized electronic components. The Mark 32 fuse for the Navy's 5-inch gun was 8 inches long and weighed just over 2 pounds. Inside its steel casing was perhaps the most sophisticated piece of miniaturized electronics that existed in 1942. On August 12, 1942, the light cruiser USS Cleveland conducted the first operational test in Chesapeake Bay. The target was 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft. Using conventional ammunition, downing these maneuvering drones typically required dozens of shots, often scores. Cleveland's gunners, firing proximity-fused shells, destroyed all 3 drones with just 4 bursts on the first day of testing. The Navy immediately cancelled the remainder of the scheduled tests and ordered mass production to begin. 5 companies were selected to manufacture the fuses: Crosley Corporation, Radio Corporation of America, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris. Production started slowly. By the end of 1942, factories were producing 500 fuses per day. But American industrial capacity was just warming up. By late 1943, production had reached 40,000 fuses per day. Over the course of the war, American industry produced more than 22 million proximity fuses at a cost exceeding $1 billion 1940s dollars. More than 100 factories participated in some phase of production. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati alone produced 525,913 fuses, representing 24% of total production. The company employed 10,000 workers, operating continuously 7 days a week, achieving peak output of 16,500 fuses daily. Sylvania Electric Products in Ipswich, Massachusetts produced even more, manufacturing 5,683,302 fuses, while also producing 95% of all miniature vacuum tubes used across the program. Thousands of workers, many of them women, assembled the intricate components under conditions of absolute secrecy. Workers signed secrecy oaths and were searched entering and leaving the facilities. They did not know what they were building. They knew only that their work was classified, that precision mattered, and that soldiers' lives depended on quality. Security surrounding the proximity fuse was second only to the Manhattan Project. The device was given the deliberately misleading code name VT fuse, supposedly standing for variable time, to disguise its true nature as a radio proximity detector. The very existence of the fuse was classified top secret. Even its use in combat was initially restricted to situations where there was no chance of a dud falling into enemy hands. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. 4 Japanese Aichi-D, 3A dive bombers attacked a U.S. Navy task force. As the aircraft broke off their attack, Lieutenant Commander Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch battery on the cruiser USS Helena, fired 3 salvos of proximity-fused shells at the departing bombers. All 3 shells exploded near one of the aircraft, shredding it with shrapnel. The aircraft plunged into the sea. Helena's gunners had achieved what would have required dozens, perhaps hundreds of conventional shells. They had downed an enemy aircraft without scoring a direct hit, without perfect prediction of its flight path, without any of the complex calculations that had limited anti-aircraft effectiveness for decades. Word of the success spread rapidly through the Pacific Fleet. By mid-1943, substantial quantities of proximity-fused ammunition were being shipped to Pearl Harbor and forward bases. Combat results exceeded every prediction. In 1943, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire was credited with more than half of all Japanese aircraft downed by naval gunfire, despite proximity fuses being used in only 25% of shells fired. Admiral Arleigh Burke, later Chief of Naval Operations, recalled that when he served as Chief of Staff to Admiral Mark Mitscher, commanding the fast carrier task forces, proximity fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. Traditional anti-aircraft fire that had required volume, hundreds of shells creating a wall of steel that aircraft might fly into, had been transformed into precision fire where individual shells hunted targets. But for most of the war, the Pentagon strictly forbade use of the fuse over land. The risk was too great that a dud shell would fall into enemy hands. German or Japanese engineers might reverse engineer the technology or develop countermeasures. If Germany equipped its anti-aircraft guns with proximity fuses, intelligence analysts estimated bomber losses could increase by 300%. The strategic air campaign against the Reich might become impossible, so the fuses were used only over water, where dud shells would sink beyond enemy reach. When a dud proximity-fused shell landed on Sicily during the invasion in July 1943, headquarters dispatched a special patrol to recover it before German forces could find it. The shell was located, secured, and shipped back to the United States for examination to determine why it had failed to detonate. This absolute security restriction began to crack in June 1944 when Germany unleashed the Von-flying bomb against London. Launched from sites across the English Channel, the V-1s approached at speeds of 400 miles per hour, faster than many Allied fighters. Small, fast, and arriving without warning, they were extraordinarily difficult to intercept. From June to late August 1944, Germany launched over 9,000 V-1s against Britain. The pilotless missiles inflicted tens of thousands of civilian casualties. British defences initially could destroy only 17% of the V-1s that entered the coastal gun belt. The situation was desperate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill authorised use of proximity fuses in anti-aircraft guns defending Britain. Modified fuses were rushed into production, specifically calibrated for the small, fast V-1s. British and American anti-aircraft guns along the coast were equipped with proximity-fused ammunition, working in conjunction with new radar systems and fire control computers. The effect was dramatic. Within 4 weeks, the destruction rate climbed to 74%. During one day in late August, 82% of incoming V-1s were shot down before reaching their targets. Churchill later stated that the proximity fuse made possible the successes that anti-aircraft command was obtaining against Hitler's vengeance weapons. The Von campaign demonstrated beyond doubt that the proximity fuse was war-winning technology, but it also meant the secret was partially compromised. Thousands of fuses were being fired over land. The risk that had seemed so unacceptable in 1943 now had to be weighed against military necessity. Then, in October 1944, that calculation changed completely. The Japanese, facing inevitable defeat and the systematic destruction of their remaining conventional air power, implemented a strategy that would test American defenses to breaking point and validate every dollar, every engineering hour, every manufacturing innovation that had gone into the proximity fuse program. October 19, 1944, the waters off Leyte Gulf, Philippines, Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi faced a reality that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Japan's naval aviation, once the finest in the world, had been systematically destroyed. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, American fighters and anti-aircraft fire had shot down more than 600 Japanese aircraft in what pilots mockingly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The experienced air crews who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had dominated the Pacific in 1942, were gone. Replacement pilots received perhaps 50 to 100 hours of flight training, barely enough to take off and land, wholly insufficient for the precision required in conventional bombing and torpedo attacks. These undertrained pilots attempting orthodox strikes against American ships, equipped with proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition, faced destruction rates approaching 100%. They died without inflicting damage, their bombs falling harmlessly into the ocean, their torpedoes running wild, their aircraft torn apart by shells that seemed to anticipate their every maneuver. Onishi proposed something that violated every tradition of the Imperial Japanese Navy, deliberately crashing explosive-laden aircraft into enemy ships. No evasion, no escape, no return. The special attack units, officially termed Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogeki Tai but known universally by the more poetic name Kamikaze, Divine Wind, would transform untrained pilots into guided missiles. The tactic required only enough skill to keep an aircraft pointed at a target. The first organized kamikaze attack struck on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 26 Mitsubishi Zero fighters, each carrying a 500-pound bomb and a pilot who had written farewell letters that morning, dove toward American escort carriers, providing air support for the Leyte landing. 5 aircraft penetrated defensive fire. The escort carrier USS Street Low took a Zero directly into her flight deck. The bomb and the aircraft's remaining fuel detonated inside the hangar deck among armed and fueled aircraft. Secondary explosions tore the ship apart. Street Low sank 30 minutes later. 4 other escort carriers sustained damage from kamikaze hits. The tactic had achieved what conventional attacks could not. With 26 aircraft and 26 pilots, the Japanese had sunk 1 carrier and damaged 4 others. Using conventional tactics, such results would have required hundreds of sorties and resulted in similar pilot losses without equivalent effect. From the Japanese perspective, kamikaze attacks made cold mathematical sense. Pilots were going to die anyway, attacking American ships that shot down aircraft at catastrophic rates. Why not ensure their deaths accomplished something? The deliberate suicide removed the most difficult phase of any attack, the escape, and guaranteed that damaged aircraft would continue toward targets rather than turning away. From the American perspective, kamikaze attacks represented a nightmare scenario that existing defensive doctrine struggled to counter. Traditional anti-aircraft tactics assumed that damaged aircraft would break off attacks. Proximity-fused shells had been devastatingly effective because aircraft hit at long range would veer away, losing speed and altitude, becoming easy targets for secondary batteries, or simply crashing into the ocean short of the fleet. Kamikaze pilots, even when mortally wounded, even when flying aircraft with engines failing and control surfaces shredded, continued toward targets. The mathematical advantage that proximity fuses provided against conventional attacks was reduced, though not eliminated, against attackers who welcomed death. The destroyer USS Laffey, on radar picket duty off Okinawa on April 16, 1945, faced the full fury of this evolution in aerial warfare. Over the course of 80 minutes, Laffey's crew counted 22 separate attacks. 50 kamikaze aircraft focused on this single ship. The destroyer's 5-inch guns fired proximity-fused shells in continuous barrages. 40mm and 20mm guns added streams of fire. Combat air patrol fighters dove into the attacking formations. Laffey's gunners destroyed 9 aircraft outright at ranges where the flaming wreckage fell clear of the ship. They damaged 14 others severely enough that the aircraft crashed into the ocean or veered off course. 6 kamikaze aircraft struck the ship. 4 bombs exploded on or near the destroyer. When the attack ended, Laffey had sustained catastrophic damage, 31 dead and 72 wounded. But the ship remained afloat and under power. Post-action analysis determined that without proximity-fused ammunition, Laffey would have been sunk in the first 15 minutes of the attack. The fuses had destroyed or damaged enough aircraft at sufficient range that the 6 hits, while devastating, were not fatal. Traditional time-fused ammunition would have required perfect prediction of each aircraft's position, impossible against multiple targets attacking from different altitudes and bearings simultaneously. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistics from Okinawa, where kamikaze attacks reached their peak intensity, revealed both the effectiveness of proximity fuses and the limitations imposed by the nature of the threat. Between April 1st and June 22, 1945, the U.S. Navy recorded 763 kamikaze attacks against ships around Okinawa. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire destroyed approximately 370 aircraft before they reached targets. This 48.5% kill rate represented extraordinary effectiveness compared to pre-proximity fuse engagements, but fell short of the 70 to 80% rates achieved against conventional attacks. The difference reflected the tactical reality that damaged kamikaze aircraft continued attacks that conventional bombers would have aborted. Combat air patrol fighters accounted for an additional 280 kamikaze aircraft destroyed. Shorter-range automatic weapons, the 40mm and 20mm guns that engaged aircraft in the final seconds before impact, destroyed another 70 aircraft. Despite these defensive successes, 113 kamikaze aircraft struck American ships during the Okinawa campaign. 36 ships were sunk, 26 of them smaller vessels. 77 ships sustained major damage. The human cost was severe. 4,907 American sailors died from kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign. Another 4,824 were wounded. These casualty figures exceeded the Marine and Army casualties, sustained in the ground campaign, an unprecedented situation in naval warfare. The proximity fuse's impact on these statistics was profound but complex. Naval historians analyzing the campaign concluded that without proximity-fused ammunition, kamikaze attacks would have sunk approximately 90 additional ships and damaged 150 others beyond the actual losses. The defensive effectiveness that proximity fuses provided prevented what would have been catastrophic fleet losses. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet during the Okinawa operation, stated in his action report that the VT fuse had proven indispensable against mass aerial attacks. He noted that ships equipped with proxy-fused ammunition survived attacks that would have overwhelmed ships relying on conventional time-fused shells. The difference between a ship damaged but operational and a ship sunk often came down to whether defensive fire destroyed 1 or 2 additional attacking aircraft before they reached ramming distance. The April 11th engagement that opened this account demonstrated the fuse's effectiveness under maximum stress. USS Hadley and USS Evans, 2 destroyers on radar picket station 14 miles north of Okinawa, faced 156 attacking aircraft during Operation Kikusui No. 6, the 6th mass kamikaze operation. Hadley's 5-inch guns began firing proximity-fused shells at attacking aircraft when they reached 15,000 yards, approximately 7.5 miles. The shells created aerial bursts that disrupted formations and destroyed aircraft at ranges where visual tracking was barely possible. As the attack intensified, Hadley's gunners maintained continuous fire, the proximity fuses detonating shells precisely 20 to 50 feet from targets. Over the course of 90 minutes, Hadley destroyed 23 aircraft. The combat air patrol fighters protecting the destroyers accounted for additional kills, but the majority of aircraft destroyed fell to Hadley's proximity-fused 5-inch shells. Despite this defensive success, 3 kamikaze aircraft penetrated the fire and struck Hadley directly. 1 bomb hit, and 1 Oka rocket bomb, a piloted suicide weapon carried beneath a bomber and released to glide toward targets. The damage was catastrophic. Hadley's forward fire room flooded, the forward engine room filled with smoke and steam. Steering control was lost. 1 5-inch mount was destroyed, another damaged. Casualties included 30 dead and 72 wounded. But the ship remained afloat, continued fighting, and eventually returned to port under her own power. Evans, fighting alongside Hadley, destroyed additional aircraft before being struck by 4 kamikaze planes. Evans' engineering spaces were destroyed, leaving the ship dead in the water. Casualties were severe. But like Hadley, Evans survived and was eventually towed to safety. Post-action analysis was unambiguous. Without proximity fuses, both ships would have been sunk with total crew losses. The number of attacking aircraft was simply too large, arriving too quickly from too many directions for conventional anti-aircraft fire to provide adequate defense. The proximity fuses had destroyed enough aircraft, damaged enough others, and disrupted enough attacks that the ships, though badly damaged, survived. Japanese commanders, analyzing the increasing difficulty of kamikaze operations through late 1944 and into 1945, struggled to understand why American defensive fire had become so effective. Post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese naval officers revealed that most assumed the Americans had perfected radar-directed fire control that allowed guns to track multiple targets simultaneously. Some speculated about improved ammunition with larger bursting charges or more effective fragmentation patterns. The idea that individual shells carried miniature radio transmitters that detected targets and timed their own detonation seemed beyond credible technology. Japanese engineers, who had explored proximity fuses in the 1930s and concluded they were impossible given existing miniaturization limits, never seriously considered that America had solved problems they deemed insurmountable. This failure of imagination extended throughout Japanese military intelligence. Captured proximity-fused shells that failed to detonate, recovered from aircraft wreckage or found on invasion beaches, were examined by Japanese ordnance experts who concluded they were some form of advanced mechanical time fuse. The radio components inside were so miniaturized, so unlike anything in Japanese experience, that analysts assumed they served some other purpose, perhaps related to safety mechanisms. The Japanese never developed countermeasures because they never understood what they faced. Electronic jamming, theoretically possible if the fuse's operating frequency and characteristics were known, was never implemented. Tactical adaptations, such as low-altitude approaches that might confuse radio proximity detection, were tried based on general principles, but not optimized because the underlying technology remained mysterious. This intelligence failure had strategic consequences. Japanese kamikaze tactics evolved throughout 1945, but the evolution focused on overwhelming defenses through mass attacks rather than adapting to proximity fuses specifically. The massive Kikusui operations that struck Okinawa involved hundreds of aircraft attacking simultaneously, attempting to saturate American defenses. This approach partially succeeded, but at enormous cost in aircraft and pilots that Japan could not sustain. Had Japanese commanders understood they were facing radio proximity fuses, they might have allocated resources differently. Low-altitude approaches just above the wave tops, where radio reflections from the ocean surface could cause premature detonation, would have been standard rather than occasional. Night attacks, where visual tracking was difficult and radar-directed fire was less precise, would have received priority. Dispersed attacks by small groups rather than mass formations might have reduced the effectiveness of concentrated proximity-fused fire, but these adaptations required understanding the nature of the threat. Without that understanding, Japanese tactics remained reactive rather than specifically optimized. The result was continuing high losses among kamikaze aircraft, with an ever-decreasing percentage successfully striking targets. By June 1945, as Okinawa fell and American planners prepared for the invasion of Japan itself, the proximity fuse had established itself as perhaps the most critical defense against the aerial suicide attacks that would certainly intensify during home island operations. Production was accelerated beyond previous peaks. Ammunition ships in the Pacific carried vast stocks of proxy-fused shells. Every major combatant ship had magazines filled with VT ammunition. The planned invasion of Kyushu in November 1945, Operation Olympic, and the subsequent invasion of Honshu in March 1946, Operation Coronet, assumed kamikaze attacks on a scale that dwarfed Okinawa. Japanese plans captured after the war revealed preparations for thousands of kamikaze aircraft, including trainers and obsolete models pressed into suicide roles. Against such attacks, proximity fuses represented the difference between acceptable losses and catastrophic fleet damage that might render amphibious operations impossible. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 and Japan's subsequent surrender meant that this apocalyptic scenario never materialized. The proximity fuse's role in defending against the ultimate kamikaze onslaught remained theoretical, but the weapon's effectiveness during the actual campaigns from October 1944 through August 1945 had proven decisive in maintaining American naval operations, despite the kamikaze's best efforts. The human dimension of proximity fuse effectiveness extended beyond statistics into the psychological realm. American sailors who survived kamikaze attacks consistently cited the proximity fuses as providing psychological confidence that would otherwise have been impossible. Knowing that their ship's guns could destroy aircraft at long range, that individual shells hunted targets rather than simply filling sky with explosive, allowed crews to maintain discipline under attacks that were psychologically devastating. Watching aircraft deliberately crash into ships, seeing pilots who should have pulled up continuing straight into the superstructure, created a terror distinct from conventional combat. The knowledge that defensive fire was optimized, that every shell had maximum probability of destroying attackers, provided reassurance that offset some of this psychological trauma. Medical officers noted that ships equipped with proxy-fused ammunition reported lower incidence of combat fatigue and breakdown compared to earlier campaigns. Conversely, kamikaze pilots faced psychological burdens that American defensive improvements intensified. Survivor accounts from the small number of pilots who returned after aborted missions and post-war interviews with pilots who had been in training when the war ended revealed that the increasing effectiveness of American anti-aircraft fire created fatalism that extended beyond the already suicidal nature of the mission. Pilots understood they were unlikely to reach targets. Training emphasized that perhaps 1 in 3 aircraft would successfully strike an American ship. As American defenses improved through early 1945, that ratio fell to 1 in 5, then 1 in 10. By Okinawa, survival rates among kamikaze pilots attempting to reach targets had fallen below 10%. This knowledge, combined with the physical reality of watching fellow pilots torn apart by anti-aircraft fire that seemed impossibly accurate, created psychological trauma even among volunteers who had accepted death. Some pilots diverted to alternate targets, attacking landing craft or shore installations, rather than continuing through the curtain of proximity-fused fire around major ships. Others froze at critical moments, their aircraft's final dive lacking the commitment necessary to overcome last-second defensive fire. Japanese commanders struggled with this psychological deterioration. The entire kamikaze concept required pilots who maintained focus and determination through the final seconds of their lives. As losses mounted and success rates fell, maintaining that psychological edge became increasingly difficult. Units reported instances of pilots drinking heavily before missions, requiring physical restraint to enter aircraft, or deliberately crash diving into the ocean short of targets, rather than flying through American anti-aircraft fire. The proximity fuse contributed to this psychological collapse not through any single engagement, but through the accumulated weight of effectiveness that made kamikaze missions feel futile, even to pilots who had accepted death. This psychological dimension, difficult to quantify but repeatedly noted in Japanese military documents, represented an additional strategic benefit beyond the direct destruction of attacking aircraft. The production achievement that enabled such extensive use of proximity fuses in the Pacific theater, while simultaneously supporting European operations and zone defense, represented American industrial capacity at its peak. By mid-1945, factories were producing 70,000 fuses daily. The supply chain involved 87 primary firms using 110 factories, supported by over 2,000 specialized suppliers, providing components. The cost per fuse had fallen from $732 in 1942 to $18 by 1945, as manufacturing techniques improved and economies of scale took effect. At $18 per fuse, the weapon remained expensive compared to the $5 cost of the shell itself, but the enhanced lethality justified the expense. A proximity-fused shell was worth 5 to 10 conventional shells in terms of target effect. This production scale was enabled by manufacturing innovations developed specifically for the fuse program. Automated assembly lines using techniques adapted from automotive production allowed relatively unskilled workers to assemble complex electronic components with consistent quality. Statistical quality control methods, pioneered at Western Electric and expanded across all fuse manufacturers, ensured reliability above 90% despite the complexity of each unit. The workforce training programs developed for fuse production became models for post-war industry. Workers, many of them women with no prior technical experience, received intensive training in precision assembly, quality inspection, and testing procedures. They learned to work under microscopes, positioning tiny components using tweezers, soldering connections that could not be seen with the naked eye. This trained workforce would form the foundation of America's post-war electronics industry. The intellectual capital developed during the proximity fuse program extended beyond manufacturing into fundamental advances in electronics. Miniaturization techniques necessary to fit 130 components into an 8-inch fuse body pioneered methods that would enable transistor radios, early computers, and eventually integrated circuits. The printed circuit boards used in later proximity fuse models were among the first mass-produced examples of technology that would revolutionize electronics. James Van Allen, the physicist who developed ruggedized vacuum tubes for proximity fuses, applied the same miniaturization principles to scientific instruments for space exploration. The Explorer 1 satellite, launched in January 1958 and credited with discovering the Van Allen radiation belts, carried instruments that drew directly on proximity fuse technology. The techniques for making electronics survive 20,000 G artillery launch enabled electronics that could survive rocket launches into space. Merle Tuve, returning to the Carnegie Institution after the war, rarely discussed his role developing proximity fuses. When the project was declassified in September 1945, he deflected personal credit, emphasizing the contributions of hundreds of engineers and thousands of production workers. His modesty understated his essential leadership in a program that War Department officials ranked second only to the atomic bomb in strategic importance. The proximity fuse's legacy extended into the Cold War and beyond. Modern air defense systems, from the Nike missiles of the 1950s through the Patriot missiles of today, use proximity fuses based on the same fundamental concept developed in 1942. Contemporary fuses use solid-state electronics, microprocessors, and sophisticated signal processing. They can discriminate between real targets and decoys, operate in jamming environments, and adjust detonation points based on target characteristics. But the core principle remains unchanged. Detect the target using radio reflections, calculate the optimal detonation point, and trigger the warhead for maximum effect. The anti-aircraft missiles that defended American forces during the Gulf War, that protect cities today, that form the backbone of naval air defense, all descend from the VT fuse that first proved itself off Guadalcanal in January 1943. The technology transfer from World War II proximity fuses to modern smart weapons represents one of the most direct lineages in military technology. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal stated after the war that the proximity fuse helped blaze the trail to Japan, noting that without the protection this device provided to surface ships, the westward advance could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. This assessment, made with access to comprehensive combat records, reflected the strategic reality that proximity fuses had enabled American naval operations to continue, despite kamikaze attacks that might otherwise have forced operational pauses or even strategic recalculation. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was more direct. He stated that the VT fuse had saved the lives of thousands of American sailors and had prevented the loss of dozens of ships. He noted that during the Okinawa campaign, the fuse had been absolutely essential to maintaining the naval support that enabled Marine and Army forces to conduct ground operations. Without proximity-fused defences, the fleet would have sustained losses that could have compromised the entire operation. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whose capital had been defended against Vone attacks by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, stated that the fuse represented one of the three most important technological developments of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. He noted that without American proximity fuses, London would have sustained damage that might have affected British military capability and civilian morale at a critical moment. These assessments by senior military and political leaders, made with full knowledge of classified technologies and access to comprehensive records, established the proximity fuse's historical significance. The weapon had not won the war alone, no single technology did. But it had contributed to victory in ways that saved thousands of lives and enabled operations that would otherwise have been far more costly or potentially impossible. The mathematical reality was straightforward. Against conventional attacks, proximity fuses increased anti-aircraft effectiveness by factors of 5 to 10. Against kamikaze attacks, the improvement factor was smaller, perhaps 2 to 3, but still decisive given the nature of the threat. These multipliers, applied across thousands of engagements from early 1943 through August 1945, accumulated into strategic advantage that affected the course of the Pacific War. The story of the proximity fuse and its use against kamikaze attacks ultimately reveals how free societies mobilize scientific talent and industrial capacity for military objectives. The weapon resulted from deliberate application of existing knowledge to a specific problem. Scientists identified what needed to be done, determined how to accomplish it, and executed a program that achieved operational capability in under 3 years, from initial concept to mass production. This focused approach to weapons development became the model for Cold War military research and continues to influence how advanced nations approach defense technology. The Manhattan Project, developing atomic weapons, followed similar organizational patterns. Post-war missile programs adopted the same structure of university laboratories, industrial contractors, and military oversight coordinated through centralized management. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the proximity fuse lies in what it represented to the enemies who faced it. Japanese kamikaze pilots, flying toward American ships through curtains of fire that detonated with impossible precision, understood implicitly that they faced technology beyond their nation's ability to match. The shells that exploded near their aircraft without direct hits, that seemed to anticipate their maneuvers, that created destruction at ranges where conventional fire would have been harmless, demonstrated comprehensive superiority in science, industry, and national resources. German soldiers who captured proximity fuses during the Battle of the Bulge examined the miniaturized electronics and concluded such devices were impossible, experienced similar revelation. They were fighting an enemy with capabilities their engineers had declared theoretically unachievable. The psychological impact of this technological demonstration extended beyond individual engagements into broader understanding that the war was lost. Lieutenant Commander Jones, aboard USS Hadley on April 11, 1945, survived the attack that killed 30 of his shipmates and wounded 72 others. In his after-action report, he noted that without the VT fuse, his ship would certainly have been sunk with total crew loss. The proximity-fused shells had destroyed enough attacking aircraft at sufficient range that the 6 hits his ship sustained, while catastrophic, were not fatal. He concluded with an observation that captured the weapon's significance. The proximity fuse, he wrote, had changed the mathematics of aerial warfare. Aircraft attacking ships now faced a defensive technology that required no perfect aim, no perfect prediction, no perfect conditions. The shells hunted targets autonomously, detonating at optimal distance regardless of evasive maneuvers or tactical circumstances. This autonomous lethality represented a fundamental shift in the balance between offense and defense. That shift, achieved through the combination of brilliant science, innovative engineering, and unprecedented industrial production, saved thousands of American lives during the final year of the Pacific War. The kamikaze attacks that Japanese commanders hoped would offset conventional military disadvantages instead met defensive technology that turned desperation tactics into futile gestures. The Divine Wind encountered precision electronics, and precision prevailed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.